Okay. Whew. All right, what you got going?
I have dutifully listened to all the testimony and suggestions, and I think we've received some really good input. Number one, the policy is not clear. Number two, the policy needs to be made clear. And in an effort to try and do that, I would revisit what I said earlier in that and it kind of goes along the lines of what Barry Nelson discussed. The goal is the statewide reduction in dependency on the Delta and improve regional self-reliance. That's a statewide goal. But as it applies to a particular water transfer, which is what this language is about, an individual agency requesting that transfer has been directed by the legislature to do several things. One, create an urban or an ag water management plan. And then within that plan, identify the actions that they can take that are practical and feasible in their area to reduce their water use, improve their efficiency. With that in the plan, there is a commensurate requirement to implement that plan. And I think those are the standards that the applicant agency requesting a water transfer ought to be held to. And I think that's in keeping with the spirit of this, but it narrows the review and makes it a pretty easy test. If it should ever rise to the level of coming to us, then one, do you have an ag or urban water management plan, yes or no? Have you identified steps such as the legislature has suggested that you do to decrease your dependence on the Delta and improve your water, regional water sustainability through rainwater capture and water reuse and recycling and thus and so? Yes or no? And then finally, are you implementing those? Yes or no? If the answer to all three of those is yes, then they've met the test of the law, and that transfer should be approved. If any of those are a no answer, then that transfer ought not to be approved. And I think if the language in the policy were stated as such, I think it would be in keeping with about 99% of the comments that we've just heard over the last 2 or 3 hours.
Felicia?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I want to thank the staff for laboring over this, and for all the people who thanked the staff. That was nice, actually, and much appreciated. I still am. I'm not sure that gets. I don't think it's just transfers. I think it's anything. I mean, obviously,
This policy is just transfers.
No,
it's
actually,
not just
this is probably the major application of this policy is going to be with contract renewals. I would expect most transfers would not be covered actions, and I think that's why people are so focused on this. Is the expectation is there will be contract renewals for major exporters within the next few years, and so this is significant for them. And there are some that don't believe that those are covered actions, but as I've said publicly before, I do believe they're covered actions, and I do believe this policy will relate directly to them. If you want to enter into a long-term contract to export water from the Delta, then I think this policy will apply.
yeah, so I think it's broader. I do think we need to find a way to write it a little more clearly, just so people who are hyper vigilant and don't and can. A number of people have talked about when we're all not here, Martha's not here. They feel that the language speaks for itself. I think that's a fair point, and people have suggested a couple of ways to make it clearer. I'm still struggling with how to make sure we make good on what I think the statute does say, which is that the policy of the state is to reduce reliance more broadly, and say that maybe even a little more clearly when we get to WRR4, or have more of an introductory statement, and then to figure out how to be clearer about this narrow application to a covered action. But I see options to draft. I'm not sure. The ag-urban one is clear. I'm not sure it gets there for me, but I need to sleep on it. So I don't actually have a language suggestion at the moment. I'm open to listening. I just think it's important that we're pretty clear that the policy of the state of California is that we need to figure out how to reduce collectively our reliance on the Delta. I think some of the points that Barry made were accurate. If we end up in a theoretical situation where everybody gets more out of the Delta because they're growing, we've got a problem if we don't figure out a way to use efficiency and all these alternative supplies better. On the other hand, there's this incredible amount of low-hanging fruit left, even as there's been a lot of aggressive action. And we do need to put in some language that acknowledges the geographic or other differences between areas so that people know that they're going to be evaluated based on kind of a rule of what's reasonable for them, which takes into account area of origin and all of that. So I think we have a challenge to figure out how to draft a complex set of caveats clearly.
If I might, the one thing that would be very helpful here as you're deliberating is, as we get direction from you, are we within the zone on the way we've defined reduced reliance? Do we need to change it? My expectation is your direction will then influence the way the text is written. Specifically, I've forgotten what page number it is, but we have a section that addresses reduced reliance.
Yeah.
And that's where I would anticipate a much fuller description from the standpoint of what this means to the Delta plan and the goals, and I don't think it's there yet. And then that'll tie back to what we do specifically in the language and the policy. So with your direction, I would hope that you're thinking about it both ways, that it's not just what we're saying specifically for the revisions to this policy, but the direction for that bigger, this is what we think reduced reliance means for the Delta plan, and then we'll make sure to get those words into the text and be talking with you more about that.
That's a fair point.
Okay?
Okay, well, I'll weigh in. I thought this was a remarkably useful conversation this morning, including the public testimony and submission. And in some ways, this is really at the heart of the water dilemma in California, which is how do you have a great big state with 38 million people and a lot more to come and an economy that's going to grow and a water supply that's relatively finite, and how do you make that work? And it's not of a surprise to anyone that everyone's in favor of making it work, but they also would like to have their current position or preferred position protected in that activity. I mean, it's true. That's just the way normal people exist. But I've felt for a long time that the reluctance of governments to talk about the difficulty of this directly and to acknowledge that there are, after all, limits. The Delta is not an unlimited source of water for all times and for all people. It is a source of water that is being limited and constrained by development and use in the watershed. It is being drawn upon by those in the Delta and those who export it, this is Felicia's point and others, that we're kind of all in this box together. So in some ways, it's the one undiscussed water stuff, except from advocates who have one position or the other that says, here's the way to solve it. No exports to anyone, conservation only, or unlimited exports, and to hell with conservation and fish. Since the reality is that everyone is increasingly in the state having to pay attention to efficiencies and alternative water sources. I don't know of anybody. You can't get a group of water districts coming up saying we're the good guys because we've done wonderful things by emphasizing other than Delta sources, and then simultaneously say that means we get to use Delta water forever in the same way because you've been adjusting to it. That's what they've been doing. So I like Randy's structural approach and analysis on the issue. I particularly like the three questions. I can't go to the argument that we should convert a statutory direction from the legislature into an advisory declaration, kind of an oration of hopes and expectations for the future. What I am interested in, and this is what the policy is, this is a policy that asks of those state and local agencies with covered actions to fully analyze what they propose to do, to consider the options identified into law, to consider the best available feasible projects and alternatives, and to act accordingly. And the only part I disagree, Randy, is the notion that we mention it, but it have no effect. And so my experience has been that, and we don't have this option, this was a Hank Nordhoff statement of 2 years ago. The traditional way to achieve policy direction is for the state to allocate a lot of money from bonds or from cash when we had it, and then essentially give money to people who do the right thing. Right. But Hank said, we don't have that option. Nobody gave us any money. The recession's going on. It isn't getting any better. And so the question is, at least on the planning level, can we get a comprehensive view of a series of analyses and directions that compels the parties to say publicly what they all say privately, which is, what's a cost-benefit ratio, what's best for me, how can I get these sources, what are the options? And so if I had to make a suggestion to you on the comments, and you and Pat proceed to chew this over, one of the things I think you have to do to be consistent with the statute is to recognize the importance of the reduced reliance section. If there was a surprise in this legislation, it was that code section. It was, there were lesser surprises, but that was the BDCP potential appellate stuff with the council, that was a surprise. But the reduced reliance is really a big deal, conceptually, because it's at the heart and soul, contrary to the last 50, 75 years of our way we talk about water. So don't just convert it into a kind of a hectoring terminology. It's got to have a significance as significant. It's right in the Delta policy section of the Act. It's a big deal.
What do you think of Jared Huffman's interpretation of it, and what's yours?
I thought I haven't had a chance to read the letter carefully, but I listened to the reading of it. I have absolutely no doubt that over time, less water will be used for human purposes from the Delta. Hard to imagine it won't as long as you have laws that demand water quality be protected, that demand that water users' status be protected, and that demand that the environment be protected. Now, if you change that, if you just repeal all those laws, maybe you have another 100 years worth of unlimited demand on the Delta, but we'll be right back to the same situation sometime. Because climate's going to decrease the amount of water for sure. But the fact of the matter is climate's also going to increase the demand in certain regions of the state for water. It's this terribly complex problem. And so just making the decreased reliance a thought, it seems to me, is not consistent with statute, and I wouldn't go there. On the other hand, the approach, Randy's analytical approach, is a good one. It's a solid one. There maybe are a couple of other questions that ought to be added to that list of questions that those with covered actions must address, answer, respond to. That's where I am. But this has been a good discussion, and this really is at the heart of the issue. Either the Stewardship Council is the start of a changed discussion on water, or it is not. Mm-hmm. And this isn't the only section where that's relevant, but it sure is one of the sections. Mm-hmm. So.
Mr. Chair, comment.
It was great.
Just my comments after listening to the speakers this afternoon. It just kind of says that people are still confused about this policy, and my look at this may be very simple. When you say reduce reliance, I think it has different meaning for different people, whether it's water efficiency or water reduction or both. And so I would look at what does that really mean to people. If it means being water efficient by your urban water management plans, that's fine. And there may be some other agencies that are not out there doing that. But I think we should acknowledge the work that has been done, and I think Martha has done that in terms of meeting with some of the folks. But I think that's important. And Barry talked about that also. There is work being done there. I think there is the issue of, do we regulate? Do we encourage? Do we incentivize? Do we acknowledge? How do we do that? How do we accomplish water reliability? And I think those are questions that are good questions. When I hear the folks out there who really are the water agencies, the water users, or Ag, whatever the coalition, you guys are the ones that will have to interpret this policy. So that's why I think it's very important, as well as the council and staff, in terms of trying to write it as simple as you can, because maybe we can't capture everything in this policy. Remember, we're mandated to go back in 5 years and review the plan. And so maybe we're making it more complicated than we need to be. I don't know. But I'm just saying that I think that as clear as we can on this particular policy, because it's very important. And it's not the only thing that's important in the plan, because we have to figure out how everything gets integrated. But this is very important in terms of how people look at it and how people interpret it, because you hear people being confused or concerned about it because they may not understand what it really means. So I'm advocating for something that's very simple. If it's to meet state law, does that cover everything? If it doesn't, then what do we do? But again, I just believe in acknowledging that folks are already doing stuff, that they are managing their water efficiently. I'm from West Basin. I know that. I know what we do down in Southern California in my agency, and we did it before it became law, the 20% reduction year 2020. So I know there are other agencies that are doing that. So, I just believe that we should acknowledge what people are doing, try to figure out how to help them to become more water efficient. If that's not working that way, then we can always come back and change and put in whatever language we want to put in. Because I look at this effort as a collaborative effort, not just the council's plan, not just the stakeholders' plan, but together we figure out what is the best plan to manage water moving forward. So I would advocate simple language. I know there's been suggestion about looking at state law. I know there's language from Ag Herb. I know there's staff language, and I know that we just got Ag Herb's language today. So I would suggest that we go back, and I think Phil had suggested Randy and Pat to get together to come up with some language based on those two concepts and bring it back to the council. But I just don't feel that we're ready to vote on this issue today. I'm not sure if we will tomorrow, because we will hopefully look at a new combined language. But it's just too important, and I think we should put forth every effort to get it right as much as we can. We may not be perfect in what we get this time, but remember, we can always go back and change and review based on what's going on out there in the water industry. And that's my comments.
Well, you two guys have had a chance to talk briefly. What do you suggest? What are you thinking about, if not in terms of solutions, process for this meeting?
Well, if Patrick and I are the two assigned with wrestling this to the ground, we should meet early tomorrow morning, consider everything that's been said and presented, and summarize that into a recommendation for council consideration tomorrow.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. This is not a requirement, just a suggestion. If you had two options or something like that, that would be good. The more options you get, the more confusing it is. So let's see if you can come up with it, that'd be good. Okay?
Is there any way to weigh in, let the audience of the stakeholders weigh in on this particular process that we're using right now? Somebody represented from
no, I think there's a point where after all this time, the council's entitled. The staff submitted its plan. We've gotten endless comments from people, including written documents that are coming in within the hour that were being produced. If you want me to reopen the conversation again, I will, but this is really a conversation now between the seven of us, of what we think we can do. That's what it's about. Don?
Yeah, I think to the point, tomorrow, though, I think maybe we went to something earlier when we were talking about the item related to transfers, that whatever's put out there, though, we've certainly received comments back, but if it's it may be a restatement, it may be a crafting of, merging of language. I do think, Mr. Chair, though, from the standpoint of fairness to those that have weighed in, they may not weigh in between now and tomorrow morning, but
tomorrow, yes, of course.
I know, Mr. Mazzaro,
Yes,
I think he was right earlier on when he
yeah.
commented on the item on transfer. So
Okay, I agree. Okay, without objection from council members, we're going to continue this item. Randy and Pat are going to come back with the definitive solution or alternatives there too. Okay, members, go back to your spreadsheet, please. File item number 5, or item number 5 on page 2. This is one that somehow we ignored the last checklist we had. This is transparency in water contracting. It's language that's been in earlier versions of the draft Delta plan. Staff has some proposed changes that grow out of various comments and suggestions made by interested parties. Mr. Ray, is this yours?
No, it's Davis again.
I'll do it. This is something that just clarifies these are existing rules. We cite them now. We have received no comments. It has been publicized now for 3 or 4 weeks, and so I don't think there's any opposition to this.
Okay. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak to item number 5, water resources policy number 2, transparency in water contracting? Okay. Seeing no one, Mr. Johnston moves. Is there a second? Ms. Marcus, call the roll, starting with Mr. Johnston. Oh, I'm sorry, Randy? No. Mr. Johnston?
Gray, aye.
Marcus, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
totally aye.
Okay, we've got 6-0 on that. Members, item number 6, I think we have really disposed of before. This is the recommendation on Water Board and Department of Water Resources forming the committee to study the matters that were discussed at length in item number 1, the temporary water transfers. And we made a motion which passed 6-0, which incorporated a reference to this. So unless somebody wants to reopen that again, I'd ask your permission, and maybe Chris?
Just to clarify then, I think that the scope of this is going to be changed a bit pursuant to our earlier conversation.
Oh, yeah,
So
no, this...
conforming change.
Well, then let me do this. A motion would be in order. I'm sorry. Is there anyone in the audience who wants to talk about Recommendation 15 in the Water Resources chapter? Okay. I would then suggest that what we should do is a motion to approve consistent with the action taken in item number 1 regarding temporary water transfers. Is there a motion? Ms. Gray, second?
Question, Mr.
Oh, Don, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You need to get a seconder, but I want to have a question before you vote on it.
Oh, is that on this subject?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, please, go ahead.
Just so, with the motion that's been entered in here, we would give the direction that would tie this back or link this with the motion earlier on the water transfer. Would this go into, because we had a lot of conversation around that, would we talk about that, put the timeline, and the council would have to act in some manner?
This is consistent with the exemption language of the 5th draft Delta plan. This is the motion we took on the first item. Number 2, a reference to Water Resources Recommendation 15. Third, a sunset date of December 31st, 2014. And fourth, a council review for September 2014 in anticipation of that date.
So the language, the conforming language, would have to have some lead time for this work group to come up with their recommendation to forward to this body.
Yes.
So Martha would have to come up with some.
I will
some
draft some
to
language
add.
that conforms to your adopted action on number 1, and we'll put in some dates, and we just have to put in the topic as well.
And my question was, because I think Ms. Mazzaro raised it, but others will as well, is that the clock is ticking, and people, I don't know how, far out they make their applications for water transfers, contracts and so forth, but that to avoid, this council being swamped because people were up against the clock, and there's some other deadlines that, that I'm not familiar with that would, require them to get in advance, even the council taking a look at this to affirm or not whatever they're going to do in the future. So as long as that's being thought about as you put the language in there, so you prevent this kind of rush for the door when it may not be necessary at all. So
Can I suggest that I would say July 1st, 2014? That gives enough time for people to see it and for it to come to the council in September and a decision to be made. It gives us 2 years from now to get that done. And I would say that we would add these recommendations, should evaluate and make recommendations to the council about the exemption language with regard to one-year transfers.
All right, that's the understanding. I had a motion. I need a second.
I'd say.
With that understanding, Don, is that
Second.
Mr. Natoli seconds, starting with Mr. Johnston.
Bray, aye.
Marcus, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Totally aye.
Okay. Members, if you go, I'm going to suggest what we do. There are two remaining issues which generated a lot of controversy. One is the Bethel Island land use designation, and the other is the risk reduction levy policy, so on. I want to work through the other lesser items first and then go to those. So if you go to item number 7 at the top of page 3, this is habitat at appropriate elevations. Mr. Ray, I think this is your issue.
Yes. As you'll recall, one of the important policies of the Delta Plan calls for siting and designing ecosystem restoration projects at appropriate elevations around the Delta. An issue is that as the land subside, properties that might once have been suitable for, say, tidal marsh habitat now are probably at an elevation where they would not, if you were to breach the levees, they would be open water. And so the plan has long included a policy that refers folks to the Department of Fish and Game's Delta Ecosystem Restoration Strategy, or Ecosystem Restoration Program, to identify the types of restoration that are suitable, the types of habitats that would be suitable to pursue with restoration in different areas. And we cited the text which is of that strategy, which is a draft strategy, which is an appendix to the plan, and then included a figure that identifies what types of habitats would be appropriate at different locations based on the topography in that area of the Delta. The comment we received from both the Department of Fish and Game and from the Department of Water Resources, or even from the Department of Water Resources, was that the maps were not at a scale that would enable those kind of proposals to be done definitively, and in fact there were also some physical structures in the Delta that were not reflected in the maps that would perhaps prevent the kinds of restoration that were being that might otherwise be suitable. And so the suggestion that the department made was that we refer to the narrative of Appendix H as providing the guidance in this policy, and that Figure 4.3 would be referred to simply as a guide for determining the appropriate habitat restoration actions based on an area's elevation. And so that was the DWR's suggestion, and we consulted with the Department of Fish and Game, and they think that's an appropriate revision, and so we would recommend it.
Okay, questions from members first, Don?
Yeah, and help me understand then substantively what does this change, because the next follow-on is PR P3, which we established 5 areas on a map. Now we're going to add a 6th, at least under the suggestion the staff has. So if we go back to the narrative, when I was reading, I didn't refer back to that. I certainly can do that now, but so what does this change? It's for guidance, and I understand that's not, that doesn't say that that's where they're going to put it or not, but one, we're looking at adding a 6th area on the map, but now we're going to use the language, which, again, language, as we found out with some of the things we talked about here today, can mean lots of things to lots of people. So is that language sufficiently clear there relative to what the two agencies are suggesting? Because we also had some pushback from other entities over time that kind of narrowed the focus in on what we were going to use as far as this criteria. Recognize that was a study in of itself. So I guess maybe help me better understand as to what we're going to rely on here versus recognize there may not be sufficient detail
Yeah.
in a exhibit on Figure 4.3, but
Well, in many ways, my approach would be that relying on the narrative provides clearer guidance to folks that are proposing habitat restoration about what kind of actions might be suitable in different locations. It's not tied simply to topography. It talks about other features that would influence what kind of restoration would be appropriate in different locations.
Give me the code section.
It acknowledges the need to consider climate change and how that might affect what elevations will be suitable for different kinds of restoration as tidal levels rise. It talks about the variety of habitats that would be necessary to really successfully restore the Delta ecosystem. It's not tied solely just to this depiction of here's what types of habitats are suitable based on which elevations. It's much more nuanced, I would say. It's a much more thoughtful conversation.
My appendix has draft all over it, though. So is that a draft for our staff, or is it a draft of this plan?
This is a draft of the ecosystem, the conservation strategy for the restoration of this Delta's ecological management zone. The Department's Fish and Game has not finalized it, and so it's the best text we have right now, and it's one we've been relying on for a long time.
So we would incorporate their draft, or we would incorporate, if they finalize...
We would incorporate this narrative it's in the appendix now.
Right.
It still is in a draft format. Mr. Zeslak was here earlier today. I don't know if he's still here. But...
so what if they modify this, and we incorporate the draft language, and what if their final language is something different than this?
Then we would bring that back with one of the periodic updates of the plan.
We did. Dan, I tried to refresh my memory, and Dutch Slough, which is the focus of the add-on, is the Dutch Slough
That would be the next item.
I'm sorry. Excuse me. Forget it.
So in this, I think what we're simply trying to do is respond to a concern that the Department of Water Resources had, that by focusing solely on the map, we could be misdirecting or creating barriers for the kind of restoration that would actually succeed on the ground, because they were concerned that both the scale of the map and its inattention to some physical details on the that are other than topography would indicate that restorations that really were unlikely to be feasible should be proposed. And so by switching the focus to the narrative and just relying on the map as a guide, I believe we're both providing more useful direction. Here's the kinds of habitats that could be restored in different areas, and avoiding the worry that we might somehow, by focusing on a map, be creating a barrier to restoration that did make sense, or suggesting a restoration that's illogical was the appropriate approach.
If I could, Mr. Chair, just
Yes,
one other
sir.
question, though. In providing guidance for the restoration piece of this, but in some cases those will be publicly held lands or maybe in private conservancies, but they may also be in private ownership and be used for ag purposes and for other uses. So the guidance to those folks who maybe want to know what might or might not be coming their way relative to their part of the world in the Delta, then looking at the map's not going to tell the whole story. They'll need to go back to this section and say, well, I'm in this part of the world where fish can be mitigated for over here. Not that all those things aren't based potentially in science, but having something that's, going back to this, what I've heard several times today, simple and understandable for folks who are engaged in whether it's farming practices or other pursuits in the Delta, the human species down there, and what the implications might be, so they can understand very clearly, what it is that, agencies that are charged with certain responsibilities that are important to the restoration efforts, nonetheless, may still be in conflict with somebody who's pursuing on their particular, property or in a given geographical area of the Delta. Figure 4.3 at least is pretty understandable on a first glance. But if I have to go to this text buried in some plan that's, may or may not be readily accessible to me, then it's going to be harder for me to know, what it is that's driving the agencies that may be knocking on my door saying, hey, we'd like to do something over here on your piece of property. Is that fair? If not, tell me so. I mean, that's just my.
Well, I'm trying to make sure I understand the concern. This is about policy ERP2, so this policy only covers habitat restoration. So other actions are not affected by this policy. So if I'm of course, it's hard to imagine a situation in which a farming activity or another routine action that's happening in the Delta would be a covered action in any case. But of course, this policy wouldn't cover those. This would cover habitat restoration actions.
Or land acquisition for habitat restorations. I mean, you got to have a place.
That would be an element of a restoration.
Well, yeah, and that's
action,
what I was getting to. That's kind of
yeah.
the essence of my
Yeah.
question. If folks, are trying to have some understanding of what, if I'm going to make an investment in my property, I mean, I'm going to recrop my property, and I'm not in an ERP area, which that has certain, umbrella effect to it. How do I know that I won't, as soon as I get that crop in there, that's not any covered action, somebody's going to show up on my doorstep from an agency and say, hey, guess what? And you should have known because it was in the plan. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say, provide not just guidance to the agencies, but this is, for other folks that have pursuits that are important to the long-term prosperity and vitality of Delta as well. So, again, I don't want to raise red flag if there's none to be raised here, but as I was thinking about this last evening, I thought, the maps help people to visualize things.
Yeah.
And I think the map is still the very good, the best available tool to figure things out.
To understand it visually, yeah. But the guidance that's in the appendix is much more thoughtful about what is it that people are trying to do, and why are they trying to do it there.
Okay, let's, Randy, did you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to, from one farmer's perspective, the land that's most likely to qualify as shallow water habitat may in fact be the best vineyard and orchard ground. And therefore you're going to have the kind of conflict potentially that Don has outlined. Although when you look at the map, it doesn't seem to identify the areas that are currently in an area where vineyards in particular are being developed. So it's a concern, but I don't know how much of a concern.
I appreciate your comment, Rand. Just one other thing I would add is that from the commission perspective, Delta Protection Commission, when we did the economic sustainability plan, one of the things that would help offset from the standpoint of long-term investment in Delta was that you're going to have higher value crops go in some of these areas. That might be the offset to some of the loss of some of those lands or other lands to habitat and or other uses. And so if you get that conflict, then the essence of what was in the ESP, that the part of that mitigation, I guess, if you could call, for lack of a better word, was that people would go to higher value crops to still be able to maintain agriculture as a predominant, return down there. But to what you just said, that if you have some of that ground's retired or good sections of it, then that's going to really conflict with the ESP.
Well, and again, I think that's the issue we deal with in the next recommendation. Not so much in this one. We've tried to map those areas that are high priority for restoration opportunities in figure 4.4, and the next recommendation before you deals with a proposal from the Department of Water Resources, the Department of Fish and Game, to add a couple of small areas in the western delta to those restoration opportunity areas. But again, this policy ERP2 is designed to provide guidance for the review of restoration actions. Are they actually going to be appropriate to the elevations in which they're proposed and the context in which they find themselves? And I think all we were trying to do was put the emphasis on the narrative using the map as a guide, and instead of having the emphasis on the map, using the narrative as a guide.
And in fact, it wasn't intended to say this is where restoration has to occur. It was intended to say when you do restoration, try and get things that will be sustainable because it's at the right elevation, the right place for that kind of restoration to occur. And what Dan's pointing out is that in some cases, because the map is the small map of this huge area, it doesn't take into account the nuances that are sometimes very important to restoration.
Okay, let's see if there